Welcome to our 1-year anniversary episode of HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she and her. Before we get started, we are now a year into this podcast, and we want to give a special shout out and thanks to Pastor Rachel Meier Laughlin and Gretchen Clemans for our theme music. They did a wonderful job.
Yes, they did. In this episode, we'll discuss Ash Wednesday and the beginning of the season of Lent. Lent is a season of the church year leading up to Easter, and it has several themes.
The first theme that always comes to mind for me is the theme of repentance. To repent from something doesn't just mean to be sorry about it. It also implies that you're turning over a new leaf. You're changing your behavior. You're doing some self-reflection to see how you can fix what mistakes you've made in the past, that kind of thing. And when I think about repentance and Harry Potter, the first character that comes to mind is Snape, who became a Death Eater and then realized what he had done, at least realized what he had done to Lily, and then repented and started working for the Order in order to try to repair something that he had done.
Mm-hmm. There are lots of things that can lead to repentance.
Oh, sure.
Sometimes it's one person, and sometimes it's larger understandings of new ideas.
Right.
Another theme in the season of Lent is the theme of journey. Every first Sunday in Lent, we explore Jesus' journey in the wilderness when he's, particularly this year, when he's tempted by the devil. But it's also a journey in that historically, traditionally, and even now today, a lot of the time, Lent is a time to prepare for baptisms, which would take place on Easter Sunday, or to do catechism work, right? To do confirmations of baptism, to do work to affirm baptisms, or to learn more about the faith and really dig into questions that people have about the faith. This reminded me of what studying for the OWLs would be like, not necessarily for Ron and Harry, who would find it to be a total chore. But I imagine that Hermione would really love studying for the OWLs and really digging into the questions that she had and learning more. And that's the spirit behind this journey and this baptismal preparation.
And related to preparing for baptism and focusing in on your faith, there is another theme of focusing on what's important, what matters. And as a part of that, many people choose to simplify their lives in various ways. If you've ever heard of giving something up for Lent, this is where that idea comes from. The idea is that you spend Lent more focused specifically on your faith and less so on your worldly concerns and interests. This reminds me of Dumbledore choosing to not make Harry a prefect because Harry had plenty of stuff going on already and was kind of busy and presumably needed to focus on those things.
Yeah, and then each year for Lent on the Revised Common Lectionary, which is what we're following, the readings tend to take on a different theme. So last year we talked about them being really thematic around covenant, and this year one of the things that comes up a lot is this pointing towards the cross and Jesus' upcoming crucifixion. So we'll get that especially in the gospel readings as we dig into Lent. One of the things that comes up when we think about Jesus and the crucifixion is that following Jesus leads to death, right? There's death and there is new life, but when we think about following Jesus, we have to realize that that means risk, and it means that it's very likely that something bad could happen. After all, Jesus was crucified. And this is especially poignant as we think about the way that Jesus challenged the people with power, and that was part of what led to his crucifixion. And similarly, within the Harry Potter books, anytime you challenge the powerful, whether it's the Ministry of Magic or Voldemort, you too are risking death. And we see that time and again with so many of our favorite and most beloved characters being killed. We have one content notification for you all. In our discussion on the gospel for the second Sunday in Lent, we do talk about anti-Semitic interpretations of Pharisees in Christian history.
If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com. That's hpatchurch.wordpress.com. And you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
To begin our episode, we're starting with Ash Wednesday, which is March 6th this year. And just so you know, we did some of these readings last year, so the readings themselves may be somewhat familiar to you. There are the same choices between readings each year, so if you are a regular Ash Wednesday person, you will find them to be familiar. And so our summaries are the same, but we make no promises about whether our comments have or have not changed. First, a note on Ash Wednesday. Ash Wednesday is the first day of Lent. It's when we begin the season of Lent. And it is in particular a day when we remember our mortality and our connection to all of creation. Harry is pretty much always in the books remembering his mortality, particularly because of the scar on his forehead, the reminder of his parents' death, of how he lived, and a constant connection to Voldemort, who is always trying to kill him. And so that made me, of course, think of the way that frequently on Ash Wednesday, we as pastors will mark people with the sign of the cross, or we will get marked with the sign of the cross in ash on our foreheads as a visible reminder both to us about our own mortality and to the world about our mortality. And ash is frequently the palm branches from Palm Sunday the previous year can be burned to make the ashes. And so that is also part of the cyclical nature and connection to creation.
And I don't know about you, Emily, but as a pastor, I've found that receiving the cross on my forehead has become especially meaningful since my ordination, because if I'm running the service, historically, I haven't run an Ash Wednesday service with another pastor or worship leader, and so if I receive the cross, it's from a member of the congregation.
Mm-hmm.
As much as it's a sad moment because you're remembering your mortality, it's also the shape of the cross reminds us of God's love for us, and receiving that from a member of your congregation can be an extraordinary moment.
Yep, I've always found it to be really meaningful as well. It is a beautiful moment of connection.
Mm-hmm.
So as we begin our conversation about Ash Wednesday, one of the options for the Hebrew Bible or first reading is Joel chapter 2, verses 1 through 2 and 12 through 17. The prophet Joel calls the people to come together and repent. One of the themes that stuck out to me as I was reading this passage was the importance of group effort, right? Joel is not calling each person individually. Joel is calling the entire group to repentance. And so frequently we start the books with Harry all by himself trying to resist, right? So trying to figure out what's going on because he knows that Voldemort is back, but nobody will let him watch the news and nobody will tell him what's going on. Or even before the sixth book too,
Sure.
At the beginning of the sixth book too, when there is actually some news happening, but he's still by himself and limited in what he can do to respond. And yet, once he joins with the rest of the Order of the Phoenix, there are certainly still times he feels alone, especially as he deals with PTSD, but there is more hope and there's more ability for them to all work together, whether it's at the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix or later on in the books when they've started Dumbledore's army. Also, the first couple of verses as Joel calls the people together for a solemn assembly really reminded me of the Deathly Hallows second movie, when Snape gathers the students together to let them know that Harry was spotted in Hogsmeade and to encourage them to tell him if anybody has seen Harry. And there's just this solemnness, and the way the cinematography in particular just really gave me the same feeling as I had when I was reading the beginning of the Joel passage, that it's solemn and it's there's a lot of pressure and a lot happening, and it's this whole big group of people coming together.
Right.
And then in verses 12 to 13, as Joel encourages people to return to God, to rend their hearts and not their clothing, it brought to mind Dumbledore in the cave in Half-Blood Prince when he's drinking the poison that makes him remember his worst memories, and he wants nothing more than to go back and change it and fix it and make it all better.
Yeah.
And he can't, but there's this very clear repentance for him.
Speaking of that line of rend your hearts and not your clothing, to rend your clothing in ancient and also current Jewish culture is a way to show those around you that you're in mourning for someone. And so that way, if you saw someone with a tear in their clothing, you could be a little kinder to them because you would know that they were grieving. This text implies that you don't have to bother doing that with God because, being God, God already has that part figured out. But the idea of being able to do that, it makes me think of Harry, who anytime he goes outside, once he becomes a part of the wizarding world, has to deal with the public, no matter what kind of emotional straits he's in at the time. And I wonder how things would have been different if he could have rent his clothing for Cedric, or for Sirius, or for Dumbledore, as he was mourning. And if that would have made a difference with people approaching him in the street, in Diagon Alley, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that would be so helpful for so many of us, though, too, right? That
Yeah.
so frequently people are grieving, and we have this assumption that you grieve for a couple of days and then you're done. Like, that's
Right.
the way we, as a culture, particularly in the US, expect it. That's how we do, right? You get like
Yeah.
a few days of grief leave from work, and
A
then
little
you're.
more for a spouse, and people are
Mhm.
usually more generous if you lose a child, but that's about it.
But it's pretty limited, and what a difference it would make just to be. You don't have to explain to people who died, you just have a tear in your clothing, and it signals, and people are just a little bit kinder.
Right. And I know that black armbands are definitely still a symbol, and I believe that these days a lot of Jewish people will wear a piece of ribbon on their clothing and then rend that in order
Mm.
to signify mourning. But I believe for a lot of people that's just something you wear on the day of the funeral. I'm a
Mm.
little less sure, but it's still a way to show that. It's a lot like the tradition of if you see a funeral procession in the street and it begins with the hearse and it ends with the last car and or a police car or something like that, you don't break up a funeral procession
Mm.
of
Mm-hmm.
cars. You wait for the entire procession to pass. You can tell who's who by the little black flags, and then you turn into the street and go about your business. But it's a way to show respect to the folks who are grieving.
Mm-hmm.
When we reach verses 15 and 16, we have this bit about sanctifying a fast, sanctify the congregation. I believe we've talked about the word sanctify before in the podcast. To sanctify something means to make it holy. And so if you sanctify a fast, well, that fast isn't just about weight loss, but for worship. If
Mm-hmm.
you sanctify a congregation, the congregation isn't just gathered to chat or to watch a football game together, they are gathered to worship.
Mm.
And so this makes me think of Dumbledore and his ability to lend gravity to a moment, to take something that could be ordinary and make it special. It's not quite the same thing as sanctifying, but it's kind of close. And
Mm-hmm.
I especially think of the end of the fourth movie. I mean, also the end of the fourth book, but I think it was particularly well done in the movie.
Mm.
At the last feast of the year, when he talks about remembering Cedric, and that's one of the more holy moments in the Harry Potter canon for me.
Yeah, and I think part of the evidence for how holy that moment is in the books is we bring that up a lot.
We do, yes.
We talk about that
We have
feast
certain
and that
favorites, and
speech, and it's but it is. Yeah, there is a special quality about it.
I mean, I have had to announce deaths to congregations and tragic ones. I've had to do stuff like what Dumbledore did before, but having a crowd of mostly 11 to 17-year-olds and being able to do what he did is
Mm-hmm.
extraordinary. So,
Yep.
I mean, we may be irritated by Dumbledore a lot, but he had some skills, and this was one of them. So,
Mm-hmm.
the alternative Hebrew scripture reading for Ash Wednesday is from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 1 through 12. God, through the prophet Isaiah, reminds God's people Israel that their faith leads to acts of justice and compassion, rather than just being focused on religious trappings and tradition.
One of the themes that came up for me in this passage from Isaiah was the recognition of work, the recognition of work for change in particular, um, which is particularly interesting in the context of Ash Wednesday when we are recognizing, right, the crosses on our foreheads in ash are very visible and very public recognitions of what Ash
Yes.
Wednesday is about for us. And there are different times, particularly I was struck by the Order of the Phoenix when Molly is leading the battle against Grimald Place.
Yeah.
And it is really important that the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix be livable and not
Yes.
full of hidden curses and snuff boxes that will put you to sleep and robes that will try to strangle you. But it doesn't get acknowledged very much. Harry, as our unreliable narrator, does mention as he's doing it that it really felt like war against the house.
Yeah.
Um, but nobody really gives it proper credit because of, sexism and it's
Yeah.
women's work and housework and all of that. But it really was so important, and it's so important to have those acknowledgments, not to boast about them or to make a show of them, but to acknowledge people
Yeah.
when they are doing things that are important. The first verse also made me think about Harry and the way that he really does shout it out when he's upset, particularly with Umbridge at the beginning of the school year, but also the Ministry of Magic. And even the Quibbler does this really well up until Luna gets taken in Deathly Hallows, that it's really shouting out with clarity what
Yeah.
is happening and the reality of life. And it's something that we don't always do, especially I think right now we've gotten so into, balanced news where you have to hear from everybody that we don't call things what they are, right? We're not really great at a theology of the cross that says this is wrong and this is sin.
Yeah. I would also say that moments like that are when I hate to put it this way, but I'm grateful that Harry was male as a main character for stuff like this. Because can you imagine
Because
how
you
the
know any
reaction to
character
that kind of
goes.
thing would have been if he had been female? I don't think that he would have gotten to have the PTSD and to be that blunt and all that and be
Oh no.
female without getting a lot more pushback.
Yep, and which is evidence of the fact that though J.K. Rowling kind of says that there's no racism and there's no sexism and there's none of this in the books, it's just the blood purity stuff, that we know that there was,
Yeah.
and that part of saying that there isn't actually reinforces the ways
Yeah.
that there is. Verse 4 reminded me of Ron, who really, like, when they are in Deathly Hallows in the wilderness and not getting tons to eat, Ron gets hangry.
Yeah.
Like, super hangry. I mean, I get hangry myself, which is why I have snacks when we record. And because I've had a fair amount of coffee by this time in the morning. But
We can tell.
Ron just gets
That's okay.
Ron just gets so hangry, and then add into it when he's wearing the Horcrux, and it's just the fasting, the lack of food for Ron really feeds into his quarrelsomeness with Hermione and Harry.
I also kind of wonder how much, and I think it's made clearer in the movies because you can see them. Hermione is fairly petite. Harry is described and shown as being not the world's biggest guy. I mean, Daniel Radcliffe is a normal height, but Harry in the
Mm-hmm.
books is not quite described as stunted physically, but pretty close, at least, especially when he's younger.
Mm-hmm.
But Rupert Grint is pretty tall and a bigger guy, and so the lack of food would have had a much more pronounced effect on him. But
Yeah, well, and especially like in the movies, they show him eating like, especially in the sixth movie, they show him eating all the time.
yeah, well, having spent some time with 16-year-old boys that are going through growth spurts like that, and for that matter, having been a 16-year-old going through massive growth spurts myself, there was one time when I grew a half inch in 3 weeks. That sucked. My knees were in pain basically the entire time. But I ate like nobody's business, and it was the only way I could stay awake. So
Mm.
for verse 9, we get this phrase if you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, then God will approve of all that.
Mm.
And the pointing of the finger and the speaking of evil. I've served congregations, and this sounds immediately applicable. Yes, please, let's do that. But
Mm.
in Harry Potter, it makes me wonder especially about how the two Voldemorts, as we like to call them, would have gone without all that stuff. Like, if the Marauders and Snape had managed to be frickin' grown-ups and not,
Mm.
have all that crap going on.
All of the rivalry and the baiting and the pushing buttons and
Yeah, and if they'd just been able to work together. I mean, especially in the Second War, when Sirius and Snape are really old enough to know better.
mm-hmm.
I seriously. And even Remus is an enabler.
Seriously.
Oh, man, I keep doing that unintentionally. That's just not fair. If I'm going to make puns, I want them to be on purpose. Um,
I love that it's pun intentional.
yeah. I love
Okay.
puns, but even I have limits, I'm just saying.
I don't. So in verses 10 through 12, it really talks about the importance and value that God places on caring for the whole community. Right? It says, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted. And as I was thinking about it, there's not a lot of times where the communal good is really the focus in the Harry Potter books, except to the extent that you're supposed to earn house points. Um,
Mm,
but the resistance in Deathly Hallows, the resistance that happens at Hogwarts, I think is one of those places because as Neville's talking about it, right, he talks about standing up to the Carrows and challenging them and calling out injustice and cruelty. And I think Harry or Ron or Hermione are like, they're all baffled as to like why he would do this when he knows he's going to get punished. He knows he's going to get detention. And Neville says that it matters because other people see it.
yeah.
And they know that they're not alone in the resistance. They know that other people are also fighting. And then when they all start to live in the room of requirement, right? They all share living space. They help each other out. I'm sure not every single person goes to the Hogshead to get food,
Yeah.
right? Someone goes and brings it back for everyone to be able to eat. I love Neville. Like,
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
He's a good Hufflepuffy Gryffindor.
Sure. And when it comes to verse 12, especially, actually, I guess, thinking of Neville as a good example of this, you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. And man, there's a legacy for you. And I wonder about the people who became heroes after the war due to the rebuilding.
Mm,
Being good at war and being good at rebuilding after it are two very different skill sets. And when I
mm-hmm.
think about who would take charge of the rebuilding, man, I hope it's not Harry. Harry is good at the like immediate kind of stuff, but in terms of long-term strategy, that's not really his
He's
thing at
terrible at
all.
it. Yeah,
Yeah, and so when it comes to rebuilding, I'm sure that he would be great at like repairing like bits of things, but in terms of planning what needs to happen first and what needs to happen next, and should we actually build this building entirely different this time around because we finally can deal with the horrible mistakes it had last time, that kind of
mm-hmm.
thing. That's not his skill set at all. Ron might actually be better at that. Well, remember, he's a good chess player, and being able to think several steps ahead is important. But also, I would say Neville would be a big part of that, and I think we know that he'd be good at it because of what we see from him in the seventh book and how he's able to bring people together and encourage them, and he sees the steps on the way to the goal. He's good at that. So
Yeah, and I think McGonagall is a really good choice for interim headmistress for that reason as well, that she, especially like Transfiguration has so many steps and it's so complicated.
right.
And so she is able to think with all of those different steps. We know she's very strategic politically, and we see that in her interactions with Umbridge in Order of the Phoenix, and the ways that she is able to challenge Umbridge, and the ways that she knows she has to work through other routes. And
but I also like McGonagall as that choice because we do see her explicitly defend someone she can't stand. When she defends Trelawney, I love that so much because she sees that her job as deputy headmistress, and for that matter, just being Trelawney's colleague, is so much more important than whether or not she has any respect whatsoever for what Trelawney does.
yeah,
And being able to bring that to the rebuilding. And, I mean, they're going to have to rebuild Slytherin House, right? They're going to have to, and you can't let your frustrations and history with that group of people color the fact that there's going to be 11-year-olds living there, and you really don't need to punish them for, people who went before, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So many good people to do rebuilding.
Yeah.
I don't think that they actually tap all of those people. Hence,
probably not.
Cursed child.
Well, and I hope a few of these people get frickin' vacations at some point.
Yeah. Right? Like, Harry just needs to be shipped off. Like,
let's send him to Disney World for a few weeks, shall we?
There you go. Our second reading for Ash Wednesday is from 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20b through chapter 6, verse 10. A faithful life will not be perfect, but God is still at work through it. One of the themes that came up for me was the theme of reconciliation. It comes up right at the beginning of this passage. And one of the unique ways that reconciliation is framed that we don't always talk about in the church is that we as humanity, as the ones who have messed up, need to be reconciled to God who has not messed up. And so I think about that in the magical world, and it's that the ministry of magic and so many people in the magical world need to be reconciled to Harry, who has been true the whole time to this calling and to what is actually happening in the injustice in the world.
Right.
And that also reminds me, in the Lutheran Church, the way that the term that's used for congregations that have done the work to explicitly welcome, include, and affirm people of all sexual orientations and gender identities is to be a reconciling in Christ congregation or synod or seminary or college. And I think too frequently we still have the power dynamics such that we think LGBTQIA plus people have to be reconciled to the church. But really what needs to happen is that the church needs to be reconciled to those of us who are queer, those of us who have been left out and excluded, because that's the church's sin to reconcile for.
It is explicitly the institution or the church body or the community that is doing the reconciling when it comes to that term. Yeah. So we mentioned earlier that we weren't making any promises about whether or not we were going to repeat ourselves from last year. And as far as I know, I'm only going to do this once. But I had a thought, and it sounded very familiar to me, so I went and looked at the notes from last year, and lo and behold, I had this thought last year too. And I really like it still, so I thought I'd share it again. When it comes to verse 1, when we consider the idea of what it might mean to accept the grace of God in vain, as put in verse 1. I've always thought that to accept the grace of God in vain was like saying that you're, sure, I accept God's grace, absolutely, but then you turn around and you make that grace, that faith, all about law after all.
Like, you have to say these words, you have to... do
Yes.
these things.
In order to receive God's grace, you have to do A, B, and C, and if you don't, then you're going to hell, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's not accepting grace. It reminds me of, like, when a person says that, and actually, come to think of it, I'm not sure I have a Harry Potter example for this, but occasionally I've had someone, they've apologized, I say I forgive them, and then they refuse to accept the forgiveness. Like, they think that they still have to earn something, they still keep poking at it, and they still keep being convinced that they're not really forgiven yet because they don't feel like they've earned it.
Oh, yeah.
And
That happens a lot for me with pronouns, where,
ooh, yeah.
like, I get it. It's a new pronoun for you to use or whatever.
Sure.
And apologize and move on. And if you keep doing it over and over again and your apologies just get longer and longer, it's like, no, at some point I'm going to, like, disengage. But, like,
don't make it about you. This isn't about you.
Don't make it about you. I'll give you, like, tools of, like, try these things. They might help you practice the pronouns, whatever. But, like, apologies, short, sweet, and do better.
Yeah, exactly. Repentance rather than just the emotional reaction. Yeah. Actually change your behavior. But there are folks who don't seem to want to leave anything for God to do. They want to make it on their own. They want to earn it, that kind of thing. And I feel like there are people like that in the Harry Potter canon, but so many of the examples I want to use are from fan fiction. Which is and I'm not sure that I can immediately reference which stories they're from.
Okay.
Because
I was like,
I've been reading Harry Potter fan fiction for well over 10 years now, maybe 15. Oh, goodness, I'm old. And that's kind of an issue. So, yeah, I guess the immediate example of people who can't believe themselves forgiven are the house elves. They have to punish themselves, right, in order to deal with
especially Dobby
that.
because of the way that he's been trained by the Malfoys.
Yeah. And so they can't accept immediate forgiveness. They have to, and that's just icky on so many levels. But I feel like there are other examples too. So if you think of anyone in the Harry Potter series that cannot accept that they have been forgiven, please let us know by tweeting at us or talking to us on Facebook.
Yeah. Verses 4 through 8 really talk about all of the stuff that is going into this ministry, right? There's afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, all of these things that go into it. And it's as if Paul is saying we're putting literally everything possible and imaginable into this, which is A, not great boundaries. But B, I was thinking about it, and there are times when we do have to put everything into work, right? I think it's not okay to do it all the time because you'll burn out. But like in the middle of the war, Harry in Deathly Hallows, Harry and Hermione and Ron were putting everything into finding these Horcruxes.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes there is a need for us to do that as well. It's trickier right now because there's so much that we could be putting our efforts towards and so much that is of immediate need and ongoing, and so it's a little bit more complex when things are ongoing because you have to be able to sustain yourself.
Compassion fatigue is a real thing.
Yeah.
In verses 7 and 8, we hear that Christians have commended themselves with, quote, the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and in dishonor, in ill repute and good repute. And I include that whole left and right hand thing because the left hand in biblical culture was only used for unclean purposes. I'll let you imagine what those are. And so the idea of righteousness in the left hand would have been radical to the listeners of this passage. And so when I think about who in Harry Potter would have had righteousness in their left hand or have commended themselves in ill repute or in dishonor, the immediate example that pops to mind again is Snape, who did all of that through being a double agent. And yes, he worked for the Order, but he was a Death Eater. There are some things you don't get to stop doing. And once you've become a Death Eater, you don't get to undo that, you know?
Right, Karkaroff tried.
Yeah, that didn't go so well. So he was a Death Eater, but he also was a member of the Order and worked against them. And so he commended himself through what I'd call a weapon of righteousness for the left hand. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I also was struck by, in verse 9, paradoxes, right, of unknown and yet well-known, dying and alive, punished and not killed. And that reminded me a lot of Harry, particularly at the end of Deathly Hallows, because he knows that he's dying, right? He's going to, literally going to his death. And yet, he's not going to be killed. He's suffering, and yet he'll survive. And so I just thought
not that he's figured that part out yet, but yeah.
Right. Like, he doesn't know it, but Paul knows it for him.
Our gospel reading for Ash Wednesday is Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 6 and 16 through 21. Jesus discusses spiritual practices and the importance of not using them to show off, which is hypocrisy.
So one of the themes here is showing off, right? The hypocrisy of being tough and bravado. And
we don't know anyone like that.
No. Malfoy, no. But the one that was kind of sticking out to me the most was Draco in the Sorcerer's Stone or Philosopher's Stone, when he grabs the Remembrall from after Neville falls off the broom, and he like takes it up on a broom, and Harry goes up also. And once Draco realizes not only that Harry actually has a talent for flying, but also that he's alone, he doesn't have Crabbe and Goyle to back him up.
Right.
He loses all of his bravado, and he's like, uh-oh, now I have to figure out a way to save face and get out of this.
Yeah. I do actually remember loving that scene, not just because it's a really nice way to illustrate who Malfoy and Harry both are, but also because, is it just me, or we all had that classmate, right? Like, if not multiples of them. It's like every class, I think, probably had a Neville. Every class had a Draco. They weren't always boys. One of the things that Ms. Rowling did so well was to create a class that felt real, because we had those classmates. So I loved that about the books.
Yeah.
So we hit verse 3, and hey, here's that right and left hand thing again.
And I feel like we just talked about that.
Funny how that works. And I've always heard this phrase, and having preached Ash Wednesday several times now, I knew where it was from. But to be honest with you, in terms of this phrase of the don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing, I don't know that I had ever really parsed it out in terms of the right and the left hand meanings in biblical culture. The right hand was used to greet people. The left hand you didn't touch other people with. You didn't use for anything other than unclean purposes. You certainly didn't eat with it. And so it makes sense that the honorable right hand is the one giving out the alms, the charity, the money, to those in need. But why would you keep your almsgiving secret from the unclean and yet necessary left hand? I thought about this for a while, and I think the only reason I could come up with is actually the pretty obvious meaning of the phrase, which is to avoid hubris, to avoid having too much pride, or to avoid being obviously arrogant about it, showing too much pride. I think that's an example of taking something honorable and making it dishonorable. That would make sense. And goodness knows there are several Harry Potter characters, all of the Ministers of Magic, except Kingsley, who come to mind for that. And Lockhart is certainly very good at it. So.
Oh my gosh, Lockhart's the best at it.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel like Ash Wednesday was made for Lockhart, and he never went.
No. Oh, have a cross of ash on his forehead in his clothes? No.
It might get ash in his smile.
You can't have that. Oh, and his hair. It would totally ruin his hair.
He is the, pinnacle of hubris.
Yeah.
For the Harry Potter book. I was also struck by verse 3 and some of the end verses, and the ways that doing things in secret is actually, it's actually not helpful.
Yeah.
I think particularly with predominantly white congregations, there's this emphasis. I remember serving congregations where it was like, well, we shouldn't tell people what we're doing. And I was like, but you're doing this awesome stuff, and why wouldn't you want to share what God is up to through the congregation, right? When we were working with farm workers or doing the backpack program, and it was like, these verses were the ones that were used to justify not ever talking about what people were doing as a
Right.
congregation, or not talk about the things that were important to them. And I,
Because the thing about telling people that you're helping those in need is that when you tell people that, they can come help too.
mm-hmm,
There's a difference between that and like telling everybody about your awesome budget and how you have all this extra money and then not giving it to anyone. I
mm-hmm.
that's hubris.
Yeah, it's so sad when that's how these verses get used,
Yeah.
because there's so much good, and it's important to share that good news of what God is up to.
I also always think about people refusing to sit in the front rows in
Mm-hmm.
church because they don't want to put themselves forward. Maybe this is just a Midwest thing, but I've seen it happen elsewhere too. When you go into a church you've never been in before and all the front rows are empty and the back is totally packed. And you ask people why they do that, and they always say that it's because they don't want to act like they're important by going up to the front rows.
Really?
But yeah.
I've
I
never
mean,
heard that
there's
reasoning for it.
the only other reason that I've ever heard was because that pew used to always be where the so and so family sat. Of course, they're all dead now, but
Huh.
uh,
I've
so
always just heard it as like, that's the good insert denominational
well, yes,
clarifier here.
yes, no, we
Thing
we
to
call
do.
ourselves good Lutherans because we sit in the back, but it's specifically because we are being humble by doing it, right?
Oh,
Because
I just
that's
thought
yeah.
it was because nobody wanted to be on the spot.
Well, I think that there's also a certain amount of people who don't want to sit in the front row in class when they're kids, and then that goes and translates into where you sit in church too.
Yeah.
But the thing about everybody sitting in the back in church is that when visitors show up,
There's
it's
this
incredibly
terrible
unwelcoming to them
hospitality.
because they have to walk all the way up to the front of the church in order to find a place to sit, and half the time they just turn around and leave. So that's not
Mm-hmm.
gonna do
Or
anybody any
if
good.
everybody sits on the aisle and you have to walk over somebody to get into the pew.
Yeah.
Also one of
But we should probably relate this to Harry Potter in some way. So would you like to take a stab at that?
people not wanting to be Hermione. I mean, I really resonate with Hermione, and I was
Yeah,
always the kid who knew all the answers. I was the
me too.
one who wanted to sit in the front row in church, and Hermione gets teased and made fun of so much for that. And I think of particularly, right, like when we understand Hermione as a black woman,
Mm.
there's this way in which there's so much pressure to not be too smart, to not appear too smart, to not want your education as much. And there's all of this pressure societally to do that. There's pressure from sexism, there's pressure from racism, all of these things that make it really hard, and make it hard for like your average girl or girl of any race, right,
Sure.
to be the smart one and to keep saying those answers because there's pressure to appear dumb so people like you.
I learned a lot of coping mechanisms to deal with that when I was Hermione's age, and I love the fact that Hermione never uses any of them
Mm-hmm.
and just stays herself. That's great. But
Yeah.
I was considerably older than her by the time the books came out, so she
Mm-hmm.
wasn't exactly a role model for me when I was that age. If I answered a question, I would so-called forget where I had read something. I totally don't remember where I read this, but didn't somebody say so and so?
Mm-hmm.
Or I would give it 5 seconds after a teacher asked a question to raise my hand
Yep.
to
I would
see if someone
sometimes
else would
wait to
first.
see. Yeah.
And I eventually learned how to ask certain questions of the teachers when if I was like watching the class and I could see that like half the people didn't get what the teacher had just
Oh my
explained,
gosh.
but the teacher was on a
I would
roll,
sometimes
I would
ask
learn how to
questions
ask
I
a
knew the
question
answer
so
to
that
also.
because I mean, maybe I get it, maybe half the other class does get it, but if half the class doesn't get it, then we're not going to be able to. Man, the questions they ask are going to be so irritating later to me,
Yeah.
and so this was not entirely altruistic on my part, to be entirely honest. And so I would ask questions that I already knew the answers to, just to make sure that we wouldn't have to deal with it later.
Mm.
And yeah,
I would do that too, probably more altruistically than you because it wasn't about
well,
annoyance. But yeah, I would do that. I would ask teachers questions. I also was a bit Hermione-ish. Like I had a teacher yell at me once for correcting him too many times in class.
Oh, I'm still irritated at a college professor. I corrected his Latin in the middle of class one day, and he didn't believe I was right, and told me so in front of the entire class. And 3 days later, he approached me in an empty stairway and apologized and said I was right, and never addressed it in
Yeah,
class
if
whatsoever.
you mess
And
up big in public, you need to apologize in
yeah,
public. He should do that because you deserve that, but also, like, how many other people are now going to have that Latin wrong?
yeah, and quoting Julius Caesar, Veni Vidi Vici, lots of people do that one. So let's get it right.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Emily, to go back to what you were originally talking about, do you want to try to
Yeah,
relate that to
so
Harry Potter too?
the other thing that it can be harmful about this stuff reminded me of the way Umbridge's punishment of Harry is really problematic and harmful. Um, but it's, I will not tell lies, right? And making Harry carve that into his skin again and again
Yeah.
is really harmful to Harry, and it doesn't necessarily have the result that Umbridge wants, right? It doesn't
Yeah,
even
no, you
work.
give a kid that kind of punishment and they're just going to hate you. It's not about learning a lesson.
Yep.
It,
Yeah, and especially in the movies, it comes back up a couple times, right? When they're in the Forbidden Forest and with the centaurs, and Umbridge is like, Harry, tell them that I don't mean them any harm, and Harry's like, I'm sorry, Professor, but I must not tell lies. And then
he is
in
so good at bringing stuff back and throwing it in people's faces.
yeah, and then he
Just,
does it
yeah.
again in Deathly Hallows when he's polyjuiced as Runcorn,
Yeah.
and he said, and there's something that happens, and then he's like, I'm sorry, Dolores, but I must not tell lies. And it's
Yeah.
just like hilarious. So yeah, there are definitely, I mean, most punishments in the Harry Potter books don't have the intended effect necessarily.
Yeah, I kind of like the scrubbing out the potions cauldrons idea, because that was a method of discipline that I learned pretty early on working with churches, which is that if you want to discourage a behavior, make the result of that behavior as boring as humanly possible. This is what the really boring lectures come from. It's not that I want them to be scared of me. It's not that I want them to be worried I'm going to yell at them. I want them to, if they're not going to avoid these harmful behaviors because they genuinely don't want to be harmful, I want them to avoid these harmful behaviors because they want to avoid the irritating, boring result of whatever that is.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, like, well, and that's like when Harry and Ron both are punished in Chamber of Secrets, and Harry's punished for flying the car, and Harry's punishment is to help Lockhart with his fan mail, and Ron's
yes!
punishment is to clean the trophy room without magic with Filch. And both of them are like, totally think they got the worst end of the deal because of
Yeah,
how they both operate. And so it is like really effective punishment for each of them.
exactly. So we reach verse 18, and I feel like I should point out that Christianity in general and Lutheranism in particular are both very much against the concept of secret knowledge, or the technical term for it is Gnosticism. The idea that in order to be religiously better slash more holy slash more loved by God, whatever, there are certain secret things you have to know or secret rituals you have to do. No, dude, that is not how Christianity works. And Lutherans are spectacularly against that, to the point where I believe we still have a rule on the books saying that Lutheran clergy are not allowed to be members of Gnostic organizations, like, for example, the Masons.
Oh yeah, that I know somebody
Yeah,
who actually got kicked out of Canada, like couldn't be ordained, went through
Yeah.
all of candidacy, and
Oh,
then
man.
was
No one told them before that? Yeah, we tend to forget about that rule sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I know someone who decided not to enter the clergy because they had such a strong relationship with the Masons. They didn't feel that they could give it up without taking off their entire family tree. So, anyway, the dislike of secret knowledge occasionally gets taken to extraordinary lengths, but for the most part, I am totally on board with let's avoid Gnosticism, because that always leads to really bad places. So, when I read these phrases about your father in secret, that kind of thing, in this verse, I'd like to point out that it's not that God is secret or God is secretly doing stuff. It's that God is still with you when you are being secret. God who sees you when you are being secret, that kind of thing. Like the idea that you are what you do in the dark, or Hermione's chat with Mr. Weasley in the fourth book about how people are who they are to their house elves, which is one of my favorite scenes in all the books.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that God is being secretive about anything, it's that we do that, and God is still with us then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an important reminder. I love verse 21. It is my favorite of Jesus' promises because he promises, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's not, once you love something enough, you'll give money to it. It's, give money to the thing that you want to value. Put your treasure where you want your heart to go, right? That we actually have some agency over where our heart goes, over what we care about. And so I love it. So then I had to figure out what I could connect it to in Harry Potter, that so I could talk about how much I love that verse. And it was easy to come up with because Hermione really gets this. She does this with SPEW, right? The Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare.
Yes. Terrible name.
Yeah.
So many names for organizations like that in Harry Potter are terrible, though.
It's true. She
was having fun.
Yeah. But she requires dues from everyone. And there is a ton of stuff that is like super problematic with SPEW and with like how she badgers everybody to get involved, all of that stuff. But it's really smart to charge dues and to have people put some of their treasure into the organization in the hopes that they will value it more. Now, it's really hard when people just put their treasure in so that you'll stop bugging them or because they're afraid of you. Like, those are not the best reasons to get people to put your money in. But,
no, not really. Although they are tried and true methods of fundraising, as anyone who listens to NPR will tell you.
Truth. The first Sunday in Lent falls on March 10th this year, and our first reading for the first Sunday in Lent is Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 11. God institutes the harvest feast, Shavuot, or the Festival of Weeks, and Israel offers to God the first fruits of the harvest, which God has given them. So one of the themes that came up for me in this passage is the theme of ancestral legends. So they're talking, in Deuteronomy, they're talking about why they give God the first fruits and what is behind it and what those family and tribal legends are for why they do that. And it reminded me of the ancestral legends in Harry Potter. So there's the legends about blood purity, right, and being pure blood.
Right.
But also, like, the legend of the Peverils, and we see it in Deathly Hallows as you can trace the Deathly Hallows symbol from gravestone to gravestone to gravestone. Right. Or that Harry's invisibility cloak is one of the Deathly Hallows, and so he is a descendant of the Peverils, and trying to figure out how that happens and kind of those different connections and who's connected to who and who's a descendant of who. And
when we read verse 1, which is all about inheritance and heirs and so on, it's never occurred to me to ask before, but I wonder, did Harry technically inherit that cottage where his parents died in Godric's Hollow? I mean, does he own it? Does he pay taxes on it? Or has it been taken over as some kind of, like, national landmark by the ministry? And if so, was Harry compensated for it? Like, how does this work? Or were they just renting the place? I don't know that was ever actually made clear. If his parents owned it, there are like oodles and oodles and oodles of fanfics that assume that upon graduating Hogwarts, Harry immediately moves into a cheap flat with Ron and has to figure out where to live or something like that. But in theory, shouldn't, whether or not it's a public landmark and a monument to his parents' sacrifice, shouldn't that be his choice?
Yeah, well...
Or should he get to live there if he wants? You know?
Yeah, and I think he would have inherited it, and the ministry should have given him money, but much like our current government, eminent domain and other such things...
Possession is 9/10 of the law?
right? That
Yeah.
there's, and which is really fitting for this passage in Deuteronomy, right? Because depending on whose
Yeah.
perspective you're reading it from, right? If you're a Canaanite, this is not good, right?
Yeah.
Like people are coming in and taking your land that's already
Yeah, there are
occupied.
some problems to this.
And that's what white settlers did in this land, right? Came to
Mm-hmm.
Turtle Island and took over and
Sure.
named everything the way we wanted to name everything and wiped out millions of people. And I think that would easily be the way that the Ministry of Magic operated. Is to just be like,
Absolutely.
this is now a monument. The end. But I was reading a fanfic a little while ago, the one about Sirius coming back through the map. Cartographer's Craft.
Ah, yes, I haven't read that one.
Oh, yeah, it's really good. I really like it. And in it, Harry does own like the cottage. His dad paid like paid for a 10-year lease on it, and so they only live there for like a year and a half. And so the person who's caretaking it and sometimes gives like tours of it gives Harry a tour when Harry's in disguise, and then Harry reveals himself because the guy has said like, well, I charge this much for like tours because then it helps me like do upkeep in the house and keep it kept well. And he's like, but if Harry Potter ever comes back and wants to, like, he's got 8.5 years left on his lease, and so Harry does
nice.
move back into the cottage, and there's one room that nobody goes into because it's the room where everything happened. But other than that, he lives there with Remus and Tonks and Sirius, who came back from a map and is 16 years old, and yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
It's a really cool, I really liked Cartographer's Craft. I would highly recommend it. And we'll link to it.
Sounds good. Continuing from the whole idea of should Harry have owned the cottage, we get to verse 3 in the bit about the properly chosen priest in office. We've asked before whether or not wizards pay British taxes, and I guess we're pretty sure the answer to that is no, although they probably pay taxes to the ministry. But the Church of England is also a state church, and so there is the question of, do they support the Church of England? I mean, we've wondered before whether or not wizards are members of the Church of England or Catholic, or are there signals in the book. And then we get to verse 8 and the description of being a savior. And let's be honest, verse 8, as much as we love Hermione, this is the vision she had of herself as the savior of the house elves. It's a little more dramatic than was probably necessary.
Super white feminist superheroing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that when it's God doing it to us, because God is not a super white feminist. But, I mean, God is presumably a feminist, but not, anyway.
Not white.
So, moving on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think...
in so many different ways.
Yeah, that's white. The only argument anybody's ever made that has gotten me at all to think about Hermione as not being black.
Yeah.
That's the closest it comes. Yeah, because and it's so problematic, but that's like white savior complex. That's what we as white people do so frequently in so many different places, especially in the church, with missions, and we go to help the other people, right?
Yeah. I was actually pretty impressed with Ms. Rowling being able to give such an excellent illustration of what this looks like, She did a really nice job with that, and it's particularly ironic given the fact that these days on social media she's been doing it herself. But
yeah,
moving on.
Super problematic. Yep. Verses 10 and 11, where they're talking about bringing the first fruits for the whole community, right? You bring the first fruits and you offer them, and then they're given to the priests and to the whole community. And so I was thinking about that, and we've talked about money a fair amount on this podcast because it comes up quite a lot in the Bible.
Gee, it's almost like how you treat others with money matters.
I know. Weird. So I was thinking about it with like Harry and the Triwizard winnings that he gives to the twins, and that is for the benefit of everybody ultimately. But also, as we've talked about before, it's tricky because Harry always knows that he has enough. He knows that he can't just like go buy a firebolt necessarily.
Yeah.
But he knows he has enough money in his vault to last him through Hogwarts and into whatever job or career he wants. But it's trickier when there's not enough. And so then it feels more like this is more like what Molly does, right? Not Ron, because Ron just always doesn't feel like he has enough, but like the way that he shares doesn't reflect this. But the way Molly does, and it reminded me of one of my friends did her internship on Pine Ridge Reservation in what is now known as South Dakota. And one time when we were talking about stuff while I was taking a class on Lakota Christian dialogue, and she talked about how part of the culture for Lakota and for a variety of indigenous people is that you never bring your stuff back home. Like there's always other people, like you always bring stuff to a potluck or whatever, but you always are doing it with the intention of sharing it with other people. There's always this recognition that no matter how little we may have, there's always others who also need it. And so in that way, even when Pine Ridge is, the communities in Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations are living in situations of poverty, people still manage to have enough, not because they get enough money or enough support, but because they support each other. And that feels like what Molly does when she shares and when she does stuff for the good of the community, whether it's opening her home and her kitchen dining room table to everyone that comes through, or the work that she does for the order at Grimald Place and all of those things. She really embodies that in a way that I don't think any other characters do.
Yeah. I mean, it also makes me think of, in modern culture, how millennials and younger people than that are crowdfunding their medical debt and other kinds of debt.
And rent payments. And
when they have some kind of personal disaster and they can't keep up.
And like there's problematic stuff with that, right? It's problematic that people don't have enough. It's problematic that people have such extraordinary medical bills and can't pay their rent, and all of those things are problematic.
And it's interesting to me that when people have done studies on it, it's the folks who either have been or who are without enough that value that kind of thing the most. When you study what socioeconomic class is the best tippers, are the best tippers, it's always the working class people. It's always people who have personally done customer service or food service or something like that. They're the ones who tip the best. There are so many stories of, like, the last one I heard, I think, was a hairdresser who had two customers in a row, and the first was this rich lady who paid her exactly the amount and then tipped her exactly 10% and then left. And the second customer was a working class woman who was getting her like one haircut of the year or something and paid for a $20 haircut with a $50 bill because she valued the work that had been done and didn't ask for change, because she understood what that was going to mean to the hairdresser and what it said about her work.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that it makes me think of is I used a link about this on, I think, my blog post for the Beatitudes on my personal blog, and that the studies, it's not just tipping. Studies show that, like, while people living in situations of poverty are less likely to give to charities, they are more generous percentage-wise with their money than other people are. So they will give to people when they're asking for money for gas or whatever, while middle class and upper class people maybe give more money to charities because there are tax incentives to do so.
Right.
So they...
Or there used to be.
Right.
Those have changed recently.
So they give more, but as a percentage of income, people living in situations of poverty definitely give more than richer people, or even
in ways that aren't tax incentives, strangely enough.
Yeah. Verse 11 also, as they talk about how the Levites, and my text has aliens, but we're not talking about people from other planets, but foreigners, right? The Levites...
Well, hey, come on. The Bible might be more interesting than you thought.
I mean, okay, people from other planets also could come join us. But the Levites and the foreigners, so it's the ones that are held in high esteem. and the
Right.
ones who frequently get excluded in other ways are all together at the feast. And so that I was thinking about like the professors, right? To invite like to have like Professor McGonagall at this party, and then also
Mhm.
have like Colin Creevey or Dennis Creevey, right? To have the professors and the Muggleborns, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive, although
Or even just inviting both Albus and Aberforth to the same party.
yeah, ooh, yeah, that was a good one.
Our second reading for the first Sunday in Lent is from Romans chapter 10, verse 8b through verse 13. Paul proclaims that all who believe and confess faith in Christ will be saved, whatever their background.
So the big theme for me in this was trust, right? The Greek word for believe could also be translated as trust. And I think with the way that we interpret the word believe nowadays, it would be better if we just translated it as trust. Um,
Yeah.
and the different ways that trust comes out. Trust, ultimately, when we talk about trust and the Harry Potter books, movies, and fandom, it always comes back to Dumbledore and the trust that people put in Dumbledore, which was both good and bad, right? It was
Yeah.
good to trust Dumbledore that he was right about Snape, even though like a ton of people decide that that wasn't a
Right.
trustworthy thing. It was not good to trust Dumbledore with the education of children or the raising and well-being of Harry Potter. But
No.
everybody trusted him with those things. So I think that's kind of
Yeah.
funny that like there were some ways that it was important to trust Dumbledore and some ways that it was important not to, and they totally did the wrong ones.
I've had some interesting conversations with people. I think some of my favorite ones were in confirmation classes about how you have different kinds of friends, and like there are some friends that you trust with one thing, and some friends you trust with something else.
Mm-hmm.
Like some friends, you can totally let them hold your wallet while you go to the bathroom, and that is absolutely trustworthy, and you don't have to worry a bit about it. And there are other friends who you absolutely trust with your very deepest secrets.
Mm-hmm.
And like things you're ashamed about. But those two groups of friends might be very different people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, and like
yeah.
with Hagrid, I would trust Hagrid with my life, but not my secrets,
No.
right?
And it's not because we don't like Hagrid. It's that Hagrid acknowledges that he sucks at that.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Well, and so I've been playing the Hogwarts Mystery app,
Mm-hmm.
and I became an animagus,
Yes.
and I became a dog animagus. And my dog,
I'm a cat.
my dog, I'm not surprised.
Shockingly.
Yeah. My dog name is Theodore, Teddy for short. And so they ask, like, if you're going to register. And I was like, no, I'm not registering because I know that the second Voldemort is coming up and I want to be unregistered, right? So I say, no, I'm not going to. And then it proceeds to, like, make me go tell Hagrid that I'm an animagus so I can go play with Fang. And I was like, well, if I'd have known that I was going to go tell Hagrid, I'd have just registered.
I think you could ask again later.
Oh, okay.
So you can change your mind.
Maybe we'll. Is there a way to like just change for fun once you become an animagus?
Not as far as I figured out. I mean,
Okay.
you get to use it again a few times.
Yeah, but
It shows up in various quests, but
Yeah.
I don't think you can just change because you feel like it.
Bummer.
So, verse 10 talks about believing with the heart and confessing with the mouth, because they are such separate and different things. Being able to believe something and being able to say it out loud are very different. And I think we've got all kinds of examples of that in the Harry Potter books. So many people who will acknowledge that Voldemort is back but won't come out and say it. The Ministers of Magic who believe one thing and say another and all that. There are oodles of examples, and pick your favorite by all means.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think there's something about saying things out loud that make them more real, right? Like,
Yeah.
So, like, Fudge deep down knows that Voldemort is probably back, but
Yeah.
it's not until he says it out loud that he really
That things change.
believes it and really is willing to do anything about it. Verse 11 reminded me when Paul quotes that the scripture says, no one who believes in the Lord will be put to shame. It's going back to the honor shame culture of biblical culture of that was kind of more established and clearer than it is in our contemporary culture. But I was thinking about it, and like there's people are still jerks and stuff, but because your value is in a different place, you can't be shamed in that way. Like you can still be shamed within the culture and within society, but that shame doesn't resonate, doesn't hold as well because your value and your identity is very much tied into a God who loves you. And so thinking about, like, you could be a muggle born, right? And if your honor and your shame is not tied up in blood purity and that culture, but tied up in God's love for you, or in the reality of your magical abilities or whatever, then...
Or if you're like Hermione, if your self-esteem is centered in your intellect.
Mm-hmm. Then when somebody calls you a mudblood, it's a terrible thing. And within that culture, there's shame, but because that's not where your identity lies, it's really just like they're being a jerk.
To the extreme of the first time that Hermione is called a mudblood, she genuinely doesn't know what the word means, so it has no impact whatsoever.
Right, except on other people who do know what it means.
Yeah.
But that's not where shame lies. And in the movies, right, she even gets... Bellatrix carves mudblood into her, and towards the end she says, no, I'm like mudblood and proud of it. Like, this is something that I'm not going to be ashamed of, which is cool.
Yeah, and related, in verse 12, we get the phrase, no distinction between Jew nor Greek. And keep in mind that this phrase in the Bible isn't just an example of a racial difference, although it is. It's also a religious and cultural difference. A Christian who comes from a Jewish background and a Christian who comes from a Greek background are going to be two very different people in this time and place. And so this is saying that Christians from all different kinds of backgrounds, racial, religious, cultural, so on, are the same to God.
Mm-hmm.
And we spoke earlier about the importance of saying things out loud and how that changes things. And I'm not convinced that anyone who taught at Hogwarts in the books is shown explicitly teaching in a class that purebloods and muggleborns are equal. I don't think we hear a teacher say that as part of a lecture or as part of teaching a class. And
yeah, I can't think of...
We were talking about this earlier, and you said that that was an example of, to relate it to a modern issue for us, it's kind of like white people saying that they're colorblind. Or you're not actually teaching equality, you're explicitly, you're just trying to ignore it.
We actually get that with different schools, depending on the school district. There are some school districts where, like, teachers are not allowed to talk about LGBTQ stuff or those sorts of things, and that what it results in is a ton of bullying, because they can't challenge bullying in the same way that they would be able to challenge it if it was explicitly allowed, if it was explicitly taught.
And then George Takei says you can just say that you're Takei instead of using the other words, and get around it that way. But it only works if people know about it. So
yeah, I didn't know about it.
Yeah, it seems like Hogwarts isn't explicitly teaching equality between purebloods and muggleborns. And for that matter, I have not gone through the books searching for this particular needle in the haystack, but I'm not convinced we ever actually heard Dumbledore say that out loud explicitly at all. Like, not even just in a class, but like he treated muggleborns well. He never really seemed to show any difference in how he treated people, but did he ever personally say, by the way, these two groups of people are perfectly equal and should be treated that way?
Yeah, I don't think so. And that makes sense with how we see stuff play out in the books and the movies, right? We see evidence of discrimination and of oppression, right? Slughorn who is surprised that Lily was Muggleborn and that Hermione could be Muggleborn, and the bullying that takes place, especially from Draco. But that also, like, that also reflects J.K. Rowling, right? Because she also says there's no racism and stuff. When Angelina Johnson is the Quidditch captain in book 5, she gets made fun of, and they specifically make fun of her hair, which is a racist thing to do, but it's not addressed with that in mind at all.
As a racial thing,
Which is, J.K. Rowling's a white woman. She has her willful ignorance.
Well, and sometimes
unknown.
When she was writing the books, she wasn't on social media and getting educated about all this stuff, and so I can see how, at the time, it might not have been willful ignorance, but it certainly would be now.
Yep. Yeah. So the final verse where Paul quotes that everyone who calls on the name of God shall be saved reminded me of in the Chamber of Secrets when Harry and Ron go to talk to Hagrid about what's happening, and because Harry has seen Riddle catch Hagrid in the diary memory. And then while they're there, Fudge and Dumbledore come, and then Lucius Malfoy comes, and they're all right, like to take Hagrid to Azkaban and to make Dumbledore leave the school. And as they're leaving, Dumbledore says, "You will find that I will only truly have left this school when none here are loyal to me. You will also find that help will always be given at Hogwarts to those who ask for it." And that comes back later when Harry needs help in the Chamber of Secrets and names Dumbledore, and Fawkes brings the Sorting Hat, which brings the Sword of Gryffindor. And so it is, those two quotes just like match up so perfectly for me. Not that Dumbledore is God, but that within the context of the books, that is what happens.
I also think of that as his Obi-Wan Kenobi moment. If you strike me down, I will simply be made stronger. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Our gospel reading for the first Sunday in Lent is Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. After his baptism, Jesus is led by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness, where he fasts for 40 days and is tempted by the devil. So the maybe obvious theme here is temptation.
We've never let being obvious trouble us before.
Never. And I was thinking about it and thinking about in the Philosopher's / Sorcerer's Stone when Harry and Hermione get in a ton of trouble because they help Hagrid get rid of Norbert / Norberta, the dragon, and then forget the invisibility cloak at the top of the tower and so get caught. And so right after that, the narrator says, "It was a bit late to repair the damage, but Harry swore to himself not to meddle in things that weren't his business from now on." And literally on the next page, we hear, "Then, about a week before the exams were due to start, Harry's new resolution not to interfere in anything that didn't concern him was put to an unexpected test," because he overhears Quirrell and thinks that Quirrell is talking to Snape, but really Quirrell's talking to Voldemort literally in his head.
Which must be awkward. I mean, how many different mirrors are required to have a face-to-face conversation with Voldemort when he's behind your head? Yeah. Or does Voldemort care if you look him in the eye when you talk to him?
He probably doesn't want you to look him in the eye.
Yeah,
didn't we hear one of the rumors on Potter Watch that if you look Voldemort in the eye, he'll kill you?
Yeah.
And then, Jordan / River corrects that and says, "That's a basilisk, folks." Although if you're looking Voldemort in the eye, it's probably pretty late. But that was one of those, like, it's temptation, but a different kind of temptation. A temptation for curiosity and for what becomes adventure, but what is also danger. And
now, I have no idea where I got this from, but I remember several years ago reading in some commentary on this Bible passage that Jesus is tempted on 3 levels. I don't remember exactly what the 3 levels were called, but it was something along the lines of being tempted on a personal level, on a worldly level, and on an eternal level. And in this passage, that's why the devil so-called finished every test instead of just giving up or getting bored or, deciding to quit, whatever. I think we see Harry tested on those levels, in some cases several times. I mean, he's tested on a personal level a lot. The first example that pops into my head is rescuing Ron in the second task, but there are oodles of options. In terms of being tested in a worldly power kind of way, the ministers, there are a few of them that offer him all kinds of power for various prices.
Right, like if you'll just come show up and help us look like we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, do the PR stuff for us, and we can do all kinds of useful stuff for you. The only time that I can come up with example of him being tempted in an eternal way is the idea of being tempted by just going ahead and dying in the 7th book. You don't have to do this anymore. You can stop struggling, that kind of thing. Yeah. I suppose if you're willing to claim that Voldemort could have been immortal, Voldemort tempting him in the first book with the Philosopher's Stone is sort of eternal, but I don't know. I don't think the Philosopher's Stone offers perfect immortality. You have to keep drinking the stuff, so that just would have lengthened his life rather than being truly eternal.
Yeah. Speaking of the Philosopher's Stone, in verses 6 and 7, when I actually thought it connected more to 6 and 7, which would be the worldly level, but Voldemort is talking to Harry in the movies only. I looked it up, and it doesn't happen this way in the books. But in the movies, Voldemort's talking to Harry when they're in the room with the flames in the mirror of Erised, and Voldemort says, "Bravery. Your parents had it too. Tell me, Harry, do you wish to see your mother and father again?" And then Harry's parents appear in the mirror of Erised. "Together we can bring them back. All I ask is for something in return." Harry pulls the stone out of his pocket. "That's it, Harry. There is no good and evil. There is only power, and those too weak to seek it. Together we'll do extraordinary things. Just give me the stone." That connection is like bringing his parents back kind of connection, and so that's the worldly piece of it that I connected with. I mean, I can see how...
I would have called that more of a, like, the parents thing I would call personal, and then the we can do all kinds of magnificent things together, that would be worldly power.
Yeah, and that's kind of where it was going for me, less so the eternal thing, because I don't think Voldemort necessarily, like, ever offers to share the stone with Harry, just...
I suppose.
Give me the stone and I can help you do these things, which of course he's not going to help Harry do, but...
No.
Yeah. I did think about, in verse 9 and 10, when we get the devil telling Jesus to throw himself off of the top of the temple and the angels will catch him, and that reminded me of Voldemort talking to Dumbledore in Order of the Phoenix. So at the end of the book, after the battle in the Ministry of Magic, when Harry goes and chases Bellatrix, and then there's a fight and Harry starts to come out, and then Voldemort actually possesses Harry, and out of Harry's mouth Voldemort says, "Kill me now, Dumbledore. If death is nothing, Dumbledore, kill the boy." And that, I think, is a very clear temptation for Dumbledore, right? That Voldemort is trying to trick and tempt Dumbledore to kill Harry so that Voldemort doesn't have to, in an attempt to kill Voldemort, because Voldemort knows that he has Horcruxes and that he won't actually die. And that he could probably get out of Harry before Dumbledore actually kills Harry, because Voldemort at this point doesn't know that he shares, that a bit of his soul is in Harry.
Right.
There's lots of, like, really on point examples from the books for temptation, for these particular temptations.
Yeah. When we get to verse 12 and Jesus says, the scripture also says you shouldn't test God. I love that line because the devil is testing Jesus in this scene. Mm-hmm. So, of course, the devil is testing God in this scene. That is, in fact, the whole point of the scene. And so this line from Jesus of, Scripture tells us not to test God, has this ring to it that reminds me of Harry saying, "You don't have to call me sir, professor." Just this absolutely deadpan delivery, right? And I hear Jesus saying this with a raised eyebrow and absolutely no inflection. And it makes me think of Jesus as being a millennial, which we've enjoyed before. But I love that bit.
Yeah.
There is plenty of room in the Bible for a sense of humor. And if you don't believe me, go read the book of Jonah and
Jonah is the
read
best
about
satire ever.
Yes, and the livestock in mourning, and imagine a bunch of chickens in sackcloth and ashes and have a good time. So,
yeah.
Our final Sunday for this episode is the second Sunday of Lent, which this year falls on March 17th, which is also St. Patrick's Day.
Yay for Seamus.
I did not make that connection until just now, so we'll see if that shows up. Yes, yeah. I'm sure Seamus would have a great time. Our first reading is from Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 12 and 17 through 18. God promises Abram an heir and descendants to inherit the land of Canaan, which God will also give him.
So one of the themes that comes up in this is the connection of belief and righteousness, right? Abram believes God, and God reckons it to him as righteousness, which is, righteousness biblically is right relationship. And my go-to always for righteousness is Kingsley because he's probably
Awesome sauce that way.
awesome sauce. But like has the most righteousness the way we might think of it today, right? He is a good and just person.
Yes.
But then I was thinking about right relationship and wondering who has that. And if we're thinking about right relationship and the connection to belief, Remus and Harry are not in right relationship until in Deathly Hallows, Remus says, "No, Harry was right." Right? He does it on Potter Watch, but says, "No, Harry was right. You should trust yourself." And that belief kind of helps bring them back into right relationship, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think they started out in right
Well,
relationship in book 3 when they
yes.
first met, and they were teacher and student. That worked out pretty well.
Although, I don't know, to be a teacher, you're not supposed, like, you don't tell students everything. But also,
Yeah.
like, there's a way in which Remus is not telling Harry about how much he knew his parents. And that, I
Yeah.
think, feels like not a great
But I
relationship.
could see that being a really tricky thing to do professionally, Like if I was a kid's pastor and I happened to have been best friends with their dead parents when we were all kids, and how do you have that conversation and not play favorites? I I could see that being troublesome.
I think it could be tricky, but I do think that, like, that keeps them from being in a totally right relationship because
Probably. Yeah.
I think Harry deserved to know. Because it wasn't just as
Yeah.
kids, right? Like, it was also as adults. Like, Remus has met Harry
Yeah.
before.
Right.
I don't know. It's tricky, but right relationships are tricky.
Yeah, they are. As the church keeps relearning.
Mm-hmm.
In verse 4, talking about children and heirs and descendants, speaking of millennials and zennials and so on, as we were a moment ago, 3 kids are kind of a lot for Harry and Ginny as zennials, which is the term for people who are just between the Generation X and millennials.
Mm-hmm.
Because Harry would have been born in 1980
Mm-hmm.
and Ginny would be a year younger. Most people their age that I know have not gone more than 2 kids, and a lot have stuck with one or none.
I was going to say, I'm still trying to figure out how to afford one.
Yeah, me too. Goodness knows. I don't know how that works. I mean, Harry had some money going in.
Mm-hmm.
Ginny's family wasn't rich, but Ginny becoming a Quidditch player probably helped.
Mm-hmm. And then getting a good job as sports editor at the Daily
Yeah,
Prophet.
exactly. Although, well, I guess
I would assume the
Wizards
Daily
probably
Prophet.
don't have to worry about all journalism going digital and not people not wanting to pay for their news anymore.
Yeah.
So,
They
yeah,
just
I
have
don't know how
to
that works.
worry about how the Daily Prophet's reputation was totally in the tank
Yeah,
for the whole World
for so
War.
long. So, how can they afford having 3 kids? I mean, aside from all that, do wizards have socialized health care in Britain? I don't think that it's ever mentioned whether
Yeah, they never have
Arthur
that.
has to pay for getting
And
healed.
they don't.
Um,
I kind of feel like you might overhear them stressing about it if they did have to.
yeah, and I mean, it's just such a basic part of British culture at this point that you don't have to pay for basic health care that it seems to be kind of assumed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I assume that Harry and Ginny don't have to worry so much about childcare when Ginny goes back to work after the kids are born because Molly and Arthur are like the ideal grandparents for that. And presumably, babysitting Harry and Ginny's kids are probably still going to be more restful than babysitting George's. So, I'm just saying.
So true. I also, like, as you were talking, I was thinking about kids and inheritance and wondering, like, how Harry decides that James is the one to get the invisibility cloak.
Yeah, is it just that James is the oldest
Right? And if,
and also named after his dad?
yeah, or is there, like, something else? Or I think it would have been great if Lily got it.
Well, or frankly, from what we've seen of their personalities, Albus probably would have been an intelligent choice.
Yes.
Albus seems much more reflective and thoughtful and careful than
And it
his
probably,
older siblings.
would have helped their relationship a bit more, but
Yeah. I can see a Gryffindor not wanting to give a Slytherin the invisibility cloak. That actually makes sense.
yeah, but
But I don't know.
I feel like Harry wouldn't do it for that reason.
No, probably not. Ginny might. Or at least she might kid about it.
In verse 5, as God tells Abram to look at all of the stars and more numerous than the stars will your descendants be. And that got me thinking, I love space, so any excuse to talk about stars and outer space is awesome. But then I was wondering if they ever counted stars in astronomy class for their star charts. Like, how deep did they go in their star charts, and is that like an advanced astronomy kind of thing that they might do where they like count?
And arithmancy exists, so we know that there's math related spells. So is there a spell to count something? I mean, I took an astronomy class in college, and we did some star charts, but we were pretty basic, and so it wasn't all that scientific or anything. Yeah, I don't think counting the stars in particular was ever a goal. It was about trying to map them.
And then in verses 7 and 18, we again get this exploration of land that is not necessarily our own, and the gifting of land by God to Abram and his descendants. And so then I was wondering, like, how the Ministry of Magic got land or space for, like, Diagon Alley or St. Mungo's, or even, like, Hogwarts and Hogsmeade. Like, was it as dubious as this particular, like, God just saying, and this land shall be yours, and thus it was so? Or was there some justice in how they did it?
Is the wizarding community in Britain as old as London? And did they just
always
grow up in London that way? Yeah. London's pretty old.
This is true.
For verses 13 through 16, the verses that we skip in the official version of this reading, you know, no future is perfect. As much as I love romance novels and their happy endings, that's not how the world really works. And this reading conveniently skips the part where God tells Abram that his descendants will be slaves for 400 years, because that's a part of the story, but that's not the bit we're talking about today, mostly. Much like Dumbledore conveniently forgetting to tell Harry that he's going to die killing Voldemort. Or even, in the earlier years, that he's going to be the one to have to kill Voldemort in the first place.
Or that Voldemort wasn't going to kill his mom, just wanted to kill him.
Yeah, goodness. When we're imagining alternative versions of the books, I also like to imagine a version where the Dursleys had, or even just Harry himself as a 10-year-old, had some kind of religious conversion and became like Buddhists or Mennonites or some version of pacifist, like the really enthusiastic pacifists, and then he gets to the wizarding world and discovers that he's going to be expected to kill someone and says, I can't do that. And then what does Dumbledore do? you know?
Well, and like even the way he does end up killing Voldemort is like he'll kill the Horcruxes, which I think there's enough like cognitive dissonance that like it doesn't translate the same way.
Well, and they're unnatural anyway, so I don't know if that's different.
But then like the spell that he uses is a spell to disarm, which feels like, to my pacifist heart, like really good, that at least like the spell he's using is not a violent spell, is not intended to kill. So that's what it does. Well, and it doesn't even, it's that the Voldemort's own spell backfires on him again.
Right. Yeah, I don't know how Batman would feel about that. I enjoy talking about superheroes and their various codes of ethics, and there are superheroes that have no trouble killing criminals if that's what's necessary at the time. But Batman is really enthusiastic about not causing someone's death. And in fact, that was my big issue with the Batman Begins movie, because he gets way too close to that for me to be comfortable at the end. Not to spoil things too much. But so yeah, I wonder what the books would have been like if Harry had been a pacifist. I have a lot of respect for people who view the world that way and who take that seriously, but it's not a thing that's natural for me. So
our second reading for this Sunday is Philippians chapter 3 verse 17 through chapter 4 verse 1. Paul reminds us that the world will disappoint us, but God will not. One of the main themes that came up for me in this passage was the theme of perseverance, of like sticking with it, that even when the world is falling apart, God is with us. And that reminded me, this happens frequently to Harry, but particularly in Chamber of Secrets, when most of the school seems to think that he is the heir of Slytherin. He shows great perseverance in like just dealing with it and persevering.
The twins are very helpful with that.
Yes, the twins are super helpful with that, and that's part of like in religion, we are religious because part of that is that we do it in community and that we get to help
Yes.
people with things. Yeah.
And having a sense of humor can be part of religion and not be disrespectful.
Yes, I always say I'm very serious about Christianity, and also I'm laughing about it on like my dating profile things when I was doing online dating. Both of them.
In verse 19, we get the phrase, their glory is in their shame, which sounds awfully confusing at first. But it makes me think of billionaires who are focused on getting more money that they'll never spend rather than helping others. There's a specific example of that comes to mind, which is Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, focusing on spaceflight for the rich when he could do so much to fix global warming and the environment. He's trying to forget about this planet and move on to the next instead of fixing what's wrong.
Well, and also, right, like there's Amazon was gonna move to New York, and then New York was like, no, it's gonna cost us this much money to get you to move here, and you're literally the richest person.
Yeah. And now they're not paying any taxes at all on their profits.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it reminds me of Lucius Malfoy, when he was still a governor of Hogwarts, giving only the Slytherin team new brooms, when technically his responsibility is supposed to be to the whole school. And as a governor, if he was going to give brooms to the Quidditch players, it really should have been to all of them.
Yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't thought about that connection of Lucius still being a governor at the time that he does that. In verse 20, Paul talks about our citizenship being in heaven, and that is so applicable today in this country that you and I live in, Kay.
Which you and I do not take as being a sign that we should not participate in politics at all.
Right. This is, well, and that's not what Paul's saying
I've met several people who say that is what Paul's saying, but
no.
That because we are in the world but not of it, we should not participate.
Okay, well, that's not good theology.
I disagree as well.
So citizenship, but the other thing that I think gets ignored a lot is people in this country, particularly white Christians, emphasize our country so much. But throughout the Bible, and especially as Paul talks, who is a citizen of Rome and a Jewish person, your citizenship is your belonging, the place that gives you authority and space and home and belonging, in the place or the idea or the entity to which you might pledge yourself is not the country you're in. It's not Rome. It's not the United States. Your citizenship is in heaven. It is to God and God alone. And
don't worship political leaders.
Right?
Don't worship people. It never ends well.
Yeah. But then also, like, there are more important things than patriotism and unquestioning nationalism. And you should question nationalism, right? This is a thing of, like, questioning it.
Dissent is patriotic.
Yes. And, patriotism isn't biblical, but if you like patriotism, you should question the country. Anyway.
I like the thought of patriotism is a loyalty to the group of people that is large enough that you don't know everyone in the group. That's how I once heard patriotism described. And
I am a Colorado
think that's
patriot.
Well, yeah. I think that's a type of loyalty that Christians can get behind. Because theoretically, we're loyal to the church in ways that also involve dissent sometimes.
Yeah.
And that is also a group of... So I think that we can be patriotic to the church, too. But we don't usually use the word patriotic in that way.
That's true, yeah. That makes sense. But so then I was thinking about it in the Harry Potter books and how citizenship might work, because I think, right, we get Seamus is rooting for the Irish in the Quidditch World Cup, of course. But wondering about, like, where the citizenship, where that loyalty lies in the magical world, if it's just, like, magical world, not non-magical world, if there is overlap with countries, but then also, like, how does Brexit impact that, right? Like, and the borders in the UK leaving the European Union, but then, like, Northern Ireland and all of these complexities of, like, our current political system on top of with, like, the layer of magical, non-magical stuff all on top of it. And then, like, anyone who's religious within any of those, and, like, how you think about loyalties and belonging and patriotism. Yeah, it's just, like, a whole complicated mess. Suffice it to say, unquestioning nationalism, not the thing of God. It's mostly what I was getting at. The next verse, verse 21, Paul says that God will transform the body of our humiliation, that it may be conformed to the body of God's glory. And I was thinking about humiliation and the ways that it plays. There's certainly tons of times that people try to humiliate other people, especially Draco in the Harry Potter books. But also, I think it points to and speaks to the brokenness and the division among us. That when we are trying to humiliate someone, it's because we've forgotten that we are part of the same body, that we are part of the same community, that we belong to each other. And I think the biggest place we notice that, of course, in the books is the distinction between the magical and the muggle worlds. And in book 6 in particular, when in that first chapter, when the prime minister is thinking about all of the terrible things that happened, right? The hurricane, quote unquote hurricane, the bridge that broke, all of those things. And it's the magical world has been doing these things to the muggle world because they've, particularly the Death Eaters have, because they've forgotten that we belong to each other, that we're all part of this world together.
Yeah. I would say that the house rivalry at Hogwarts definitely has some aspects of that too.
Yeah, especially
because there are some fairly nasty moments for that.
And there's a lot of humiliation that goes with that, right? Like,
yeah,
making Hermione's teeth ginormous and
and then in verse 1 of chapter 4, that is, what does it mean to make someone else to be your crown? I like that image of a person being another person's crown, or a person thinking of someone else as their crown. I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of a teacher seeing their students as their crown, as their crown and glory, even, you might say. It also makes me think about how Harry felt about his forehead scar, and how his feelings about that change over the course of the books. At first, it's a symbol of his parents' death.
And his connection
but then,
to them, right? Like,
yes, and it's always a symbol of his connection to them. He always has it, and that never changes. But after a while, he also comes to see it as a symbol of their love for him, once he finds out how they really died, and what they were doing and how they were trying to save him. So I think in that way, his parents kind of become his crown, which is an interesting way to see it.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good question to ask. How can we be, not just can we be crowns for each other, but do we acknowledge it well enough? Are we good enough at acknowledging it when someone else has done that for us? If we think of someone else as part of our crown, have we told them?
I was going to say, I think about it when I was in Slovakia. I helped with an after-school program with Roma, and there was one kid who I worked with, especially on math, and got him, like, he was doing more than most of the kids his age in his class in math. And I remember after their, like, final exams for school or whatever, he was in 5th grade, I think, and he came to me and he was like, Emily, guess what? Our math test, everybody else in the class got a 0, which is like a bad grade. And I got a 5, and it was so awesome because I had seen the way that he grew and got better at math, and it was like that for sure. When you said a crown, somebody else as your crown, I was like, that's who I thought of. And that's one of the things that I love about tutoring is you can see like the progress that kids make or people make as they learn and grow. And
I've definitely enjoyed that with confirmation classes, and I've had a bunch of confirmation students who I would think of as part of my crown, and I'm just getting started. I've cared about all of my students, even the ones that I was not as fond of as others, although my choice for who to be fond of has always been a little weird.
What about you all, dear listeners? If you have those sorts of moments of someone else being a crown or helping you know that what you've been doing matters, please let us know. Share with us. Let us know tweet at us, comment on Facebook, share our posts. Let us know what you think. Who are your crowns?
Our final reading for this Sunday in Lent is from Luke chapter 13, verses 31 to 35. Pharisees warn Jesus that Herod wants to kill him, and Jesus responds that he must die in Jerusalem.
One of the themes that stuck out to me for this particular passage was the unfulfilled death threats, right? So the Pharisees are like, hey, Herod wants to kill you, just so you know. And Jesus is like, not going to happen now. I got to be in Jerusalem. But then I was thinking about death threats in the Harry Potter books, and it's like everything.
So many.
Right? Like, and unfulfilled death threats, right? Like, Voldemort is trying to kill Harry and threatening to kill Harry at the end of book
all
1
the freaking time.
And 2 and 4 and 5 and 7 and never succeeds. Even when he succeeds in casting Avada Kedavra and it hits Harry, he still doesn't succeed in killing Harry. And it's hilarious when I look back on it, and terrifying in the moment because I get really into books.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about in verse 31 the role of the Pharisees, and this is complicated because a lot of Christian history and Christian tradition has equated the Pharisees with Judaism, which modern day Jewish people are descended from the folks who were part of the Pharisees and Pharisaic Judaism. But in that association, Christianity has also made every Pharisee evil. Right? We think about, there's like a song, I don't want to be a sheep, right?
I love the song, but we need to start skipping that verse.
And it's almost every, right? It's not just the Pharisees verse, it's also the Sadducees verse, right? Like,
yes.
The song is, I don't want to be a Pharisee because they're not fair, you see? Right? And so
or I don't want to be a Sadducee because they're so sad, you see?
Yep. And so that's part of how anti-Semitism just gets so built into Christianity. And
even though it's actually counter to Christianity.
Right. Anti-Semitism is distinctly counter to Christianity because Jesus was Jewish, because Paul was Jewish, because Judaism is an important and valuable religion, and because Christianity believes that everyone is created in the image of God. And so all of that to say, I was thinking about this particular moment where there are Pharisees who are coming to warn Jesus that Herod wants to kill him. And it made me think about Draco and the Slytherins in the Harry Potter books, movies, maybe less so fandoms. But the way that J.K. Rowling characterizes them as all evil, right? Like, they just all are terrible and we never hear good things about them.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of Slytherins I know in real life who are wonderful people, but also, like, if you think about the times where Draco didn't fulfill what he was supposed to do, right? Didn't kill Dumbledore. Yeah. And Draco less so because he doesn't, like, actively help, but, like, the times that he didn't go in for the kill. Or the Slytherins, like Slughorn, who in the end did come back to fight in the Battle of Hogwarts. And I think it's so easy for us, because of how the books were written, to paint all of the Slytherins as evil, just like it's easy for Christians to paint all Pharisees, and therefore all Jewish people, as evil. And yet that's not true to who Jewish people are, and that's not true to who Slytherins are, right? Because we have people like Regulus who betray all of the Death Eaters and do their best to make Voldemort mortal so that he can be killed. In a very self-sacrificing sort of way, too. Also, I was looking at verse 32, and I love this part with, like, Herod as a fox and Jesus as a mother hen. And I was trying to think, I feel like I thought there was, like, some sort of insult in the Harry Potter books of, like, calling somebody a snake, but then I couldn't find one. And then the closest thing I got was, like, sneak, and that was, like, Marietta Edgecombe's zits that...
forehead. But she's not Slytherin.
But she's not Slytherin, and she doesn't have to be, like, you don't have to be Slytherin to be, like, insulted by being called a snake. But, I don't know, I thought there was one, and
I've actually met some snakes I like. But I don't have a phobia of them.
I don't either.
They can be very friendly.
Yeah.
Also, sometimes when they stick their tongues out, they look pretty ridiculous. And there are a variety of interesting pictures of snakes wearing hats on the internet, so...
Ridiculous.
Yes! Oh, no. Speaking of snakes wearing hats, yes. For that matter, speaking of a hen gathering her brood, which you already mentioned, I love verse 34, verse 34, and this image of Jesus as a hen gathering her brood. And this is not the only female imagery for God in the Bible,
for sure
and
not.
for that matter, this particular image is also used, I believe, by Jeremiah for God. I might be wrong, but I know that God portraying God's self as a hen gathering
It does sound vaguely
beloved
familiar. I'm
children
not sure.
shows up somewhere else. I did the study for the ELCA social statement of women and justice a while back, and that verse showed up as an example. But the image of God as a hen always makes me imagine God as Molly Weasley, which is just lovely.
Yeah.
And I kind of like the fact that Molly has a temper for this image, because God kind of has a temper too. And so it fits even better. Also, if you've ever met any chickens or hens, it depends on the individual animal, like it always does, but there are chickens out there that have quite the enthusiastic temper as well.
Really?
So he has passed away now, but I had an uncle who lost a decent chunk of hair to a chicken that was not happy about him being that nearby when he was 9. A decent chunk of hair right off the top of his head. Yeah.
I didn't realize that, because I always think about it, and like roosters are portrayed as the protectors, and so like when I think about a hen protecting the brood from a fox, I wonder if the hen actually can protect the brood.
Well, not necessarily from a fox,
Okay.
but they will certainly attempt. I grew up with plenty of farm kids, and if it was your job to gather the eggs, you waited until most of the hens left the coop, and then you tried to shush the hens that were still brooding over their eggs, sitting on their eggs, out before you started gathering the eggs, because otherwise you were going to get pecked a lot.
That makes sense.
So
Yeah.
and they can draw some pretty serious blood. So yeah.
I do love God as Molly Weasley. That is always a good analogy in my book.
And then in verse 35, Jesus is talking about his second coming here, the end of the world. And sometimes the arrival of a person, Jesus or not, feels like the end of things. Although I think in Harry Potter, it's kind of the opposite way around, because very often when Harry shows up somewhere, it feels like the beginning. I mean, every time he shows up at school, it's not just the beginning of a school year, it's the beginning of a whole new set of adventures. Every time he makes a new friend, every time he shows up in a different social scene, whether it's the Slug Club or the Order, or it always seems like things really get started once he's there. So it feels like Harry showing up is usually more of a beginning than an ending.
But there's other ones, right? Like if you think about, I was thinking about when McGonagall and Dumbledore and Hagrid all show up at number 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging Surrey. Yeah. It marks a beginning for Harry of living with the Dursleys, but it also very clearly marks an end. And
yeah.
Maybe Hagrid in general marks endings a lot, because then also when he shows up on Harry's 11th birthday, it is, yes, a beginning, as in Harry starts in the magical world, but it's also an ending of being bound by the Dursleys. And in the first chapter, of course, it's an ending of his parents' lives, of his time with his parents, of Voldemort for now.
Yeah.
Well, and that fits, right? Like, there are so many beginnings that are only beginnings because there was an ending that came before it.
Always.
Always.
Oh, man, come on. That wasn't on purpose.
I
give
know.
up. Okay.
Those are the best ones.
Speaking of giving up, and speaking of endings.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for the rest of the season of Lent.
This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Roloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles. So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on iTunes, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to be able to go back and listen to our older episodes or get actual transcripts of the podcasts, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hpatchurch.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax
Pax vobiscum.
vobiscum.